Hey everybody, so this is a very quick explanation of these terms that we'll be using throughout the whole semester to help us understand texts. By texts, we just mean things that we're going to analyze in our class. When we talk about composition, everyone thinks of writing, but I would really like to complicate that to be any kind of composition, anything we compose. We compose music, and there's rhetoric to music. If you're a music person, you know that there's, things like the measure and how the melodies and the harmonies seemingly have to work together. That's no different than what we're composing. It's just they're using different terms, and they have their own rhetorics. So when we talk about rhetoric and we talk about compositions, we're always looking at it as if it was trying to work on us to affect our behaviors. It's even if we listen to like music, we might make that argument. All of this goes all the way back to the Greeks. It starts with a man whose name is Aristotle. Aristotle was actually Alexander the Great's teacher for a while, and he really wanted to put things in boxes. He wanted to really understand analysis, and so rhetoric for him was always about these rules. And one of the rules he came up with, just to help us understand, is that you only commit or compose something whenever you want to do one of three things. If you want to persuade somebody, if you want to entertain somebody, or if you want to inform somebody. And we still use that a little bit, but we also have grown a lot in 2,500 years. And so we recognize that you can't really inform someone without also being somewhat persuasive, which may make sense today because so many people try to use information persuasively. So, let's get into the meat of it. Let's start by defining what is a rhetorical situation. When we get into these, what do we mean that we're able to analyze it? And all it really comes down to is you compose something, you make something, that's the text. The author is the person who composes, but they're always doing it in relation to another person or another group of people, and that's their audience. And that relationship is going to matter a lot because the craftsmanship, what in rhetoric we call the technique of the thing you're composing, is going to be rooted and who that audience is, and we'll look at that here in a minute. But you also have to come back to your purpose. What was the purpose in making this thing? If you think about how people persuade you to buy products today, right? There's so many people who are just paying TikTokers. Why are they paying TikTokers? Because those TikTokers have you, an enthralled audience, and they want somebody to buy their products. And if you are watching a TikToker use a product, you are far more likely to use that product. And so that's the purpose, is to get you to buy a product. If you're interested in this, there's actually a great movie from about 20 years ago called Keeping Up with the Joneses, where they sort of looked at how influencers would create this buying pressure. And then there's the setting or the context, and that just tells us a little bit about some of the other rhetorical choices. For example, like the context of the TikToker is because TikTok is a thing. It's because you guys use it. If that context wasn't present, they wouldn't be using that medium. And so we use all of these to understand the situation in which we are trying to compose an argument. Whether that argument is informative or whether that argument is entertaining, it's always an argument. And that's always going to come back to what we're attempting to do. From here, we're going to get into what we call the rhetorical modes of persuasion. So if you have questions about this, feel free to email me. But this is just how we're going to start looking at things. For example, when we're reading Plato, Plato is writing his master's words. He's writing what Socrates said. So he is very much, his purpose is to record and inform people of what Socrates did, but also to persuade them that he was a smart person. His audience was the Greeks who had put him to death. The setting was sort of a growing sort of Socratic movement, and then moving into Aristotle, although they didn't always agree. And so you can start to see how the choices Plato makes change in the same way that Harry Potter changes, in the same way that when they made the TV show for Harry Potter, it changes. All of these contexts are going to change the thing you make in little ways, even though the base story may be the same. So the first thing we're going to talk about is ethos. Ethos is really important because it's about how we are credible to our audience. I know in many high schools they talk about ethos as credibility, and all that means is citing sources, but we don't want ethos to just be about an English classroom or a classroom at all. My job as an English 101 teacher is to teach you how these skills apply elsewhere. So if you think about it, if you're an engineer, how do you make yourself credible to a client? You're trying to pitch that. That's a composition, right? You're trying to pitch that client some product that you are going to engineer and sell. You have to have some credibility. Some of it might come from citing sources, but your client's not really going to care about the sources. Your client's going to care about how much does it cost, so price is going to be a factor, and you have to be able to address that price. They're going to care about how effective it is at solving a problem. You're not convincing them that it's going to be effective at solving a problem. Do you see how that works? Like, we need to address our audience's needs and what they want. If we're not credible to them, they're not going to listen to our arguments. In a funny way, and I like to do this with my younger students because you guys are all interested in interpersonal relationships, but if you think about, like, how are you credible to a potential partner? It's a really funny question, because if we talk about citing sources, would you go up to a potential partner and say to them, hey, your friend said we would be good together? You might. But if you knew what that person wanted in a partner and instead just acted in those ways, wouldn't that also be credibility? And wouldn't it be less overt and maybe more persuasive? And so these are the kinds of questions that people like me ask all the time, is how is this credibility being built? And that's a big deal. You have to be able to be credible to your audience. And it's always in relation to an audience. If your audience doesn't care about you citing sources, then citing sources is not appropriate. In college, we care very much about citing sources, always cite sources, always use those tools. So it's an easy answer here. But outside of here, it gets a little bit more complicated, and that's much more interesting to me as a rhetorician. It's actually what I spent most of my PhD studying. Next, the easy one, pathos. Pathos is just about emotions. The sort of stereotype here is if I were to play Sarah McLachlan's In the Arms of an Angel, right? The minute you start to hear those high notes and the piano comes in, you all start to see sad puppies. Why? Because it's the song that's behind the ASPCA commercial. It is so emotive. It causes so much of an emotional response that people see the animals. They, like, I will do it in classes a lot, and people will have an emotional reaction to just the song, not even showing the commercial. But you're starting to see that's a move. Well, if we look at car commercials today, they are not based in logic. They're not based in credibility. They're based in feels and vibes. They're trying to say, hey, do you want to be this guy? Do you want to drive on these roads? Do you want these things? Want, desire, emotion? If you do, buy our car. And so that's a really big part. In fact, for marketing and sales, the emotive quality is the most important part. Most people are not driven by anything but emotion to consume. And if you think about yourselves, what you buy is definitely an emotional connection to you. There's a lot of brands out there that foster that, including brands like Tesla and Apple and, cities. Keep Austin weird, keep Portland weird. There's a whole emotive quality to that that makes people want to stick around. Lastly, logos. Logos is the hardest one to sort of nail down, if only because there's really two roads here. Here you're starting to see that logical appeals lies in their ability to provide a rational and logical foundation. That's true. However, the ethos sort of peeks its head in here because in the real world, there are what we call multiple logics, right? If you look at engineering documents, including like NASA or the DoD documents that outline success, they'll have multiple different levels of success. In many cases, businesses and business memos do this too, where they're like, it's not just successful if we make a profit. Even if we don't make a profit, we can claim success on these measures. And so those measures, those multiple measures, or that complex system, really complicates logic. What you guys need to know is that you should be employing the logic of your community. So if you're, or your audience. For example, if I'm an environmentalist and I have been focused on environmental sciences, and a company wants to come in and clear cut a forest that we had tried to earmark as a state park. If I'm going to the politicians, I'm not going to make an environmentalist argument. Why? Because they're not environmentalists, they're politicians. I want to make arguments to them about voters and voting and consequences for clear cutting that forest. If I'm going to go to the business that wants to clear cut the forest, I'm not going to talk about politics. They don't care. I'm not going to talk about environmentalism. They don't care about that, obviously. I want to talk about money, dollars and cents, the bottom line. There is still that, is this a logical argument rooted in evidence that follows our, in the next video, our analytical structure of we make a claim, support that claim with evidence, and then discuss how that evidence supports the claim, and then make claims that coincide with each other to make a bigger argument. That's what we're talking about when we use this word logos a lot. But I also want you to think about how to make credible, logical arguments to an audience. You know, that's going to be the game changer for you guys as writers, as communicators. If you can understand what arguments your community, your audience will be receptive to, and you can make those arguments, even though they're not your arguments, even though they're not something you care about, you will be far more persuasive in the future. Again, if you have any other questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know and we can chat. Otherwise, I hope this has been informative.